Okay, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for our third virtual workshop this year. Tonight's topic is inclusive event design. I'm Rachel Olzer. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm the executive director of All Bikes Welcome and Grit Mountain Bike Festival. All Bikes Welcome is a 501c3 nonprofit organization with a mission to create more racial equity and gender diversity in cycling in the outdoors. All Bikes Welcome employs a for us, by us approach to create year-round low-cost programming in Northwest Arkansas. If this is your first time joining, welcome. We started this workshop series at the beginning of 2023 in an effort to create more opportunities for learning about bikes in a low-stakes environment led by folks from our community. This year's workshop series is sponsored by Trailblazers and the Bentonville Moves Coalition, so thank you to them for supporting our work. Lastly, All Bikes Welcome is the host of the annual Grit Mountain Bike Festival. Grit Fest welcomes trans men, trans women, cis women, and non-binary folks of all backgrounds and abilities to ride together, dine together, and learn together in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Tickets are currently on sale for that, so we'd love to have you join us this fall. It is my pleasure to co-present tonight's workshop on inclusive event design with Beckie Irvin. Beckie and I will be sharing more about ourselves in the presentation, so I'm going to keep it brief here. But we are going to present for about an hour, and after that hour, we'll have a live Q&A. We'll be moderating the chat throughout, so if you have any questions, feel free to drop them during the presentation, and we can come back to them at the end. We also have on-screen sign language interpretation. Thank you to Alicia and the Sign Language Interpretation Network for joining us and providing that service. And with that, we can go ahead and get started.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you all this evening. Again, my name is Beckie Irvin. I use she, her pronouns. I am the founder of All Bikes Welcome and Grit Mountain Bike Festival. And now I also work part-time for All Bikes Welcome as a development director, doing fundraising for the organization. And so don't be surprised if at the end of this, I remind you to fill out the post-event survey and consider donating to the organization. I am just in awe all the time of what All Bikes Welcome is doing in the cycling community. This working in outdoor education and having access to the outdoors and nature completely transformed my life. I can't imagine my life without it. Shaped my entire career. I went on to get a master's degree in recreation and sport management because of it. And then obviously founded All Bikes Welcome and Grit Fest. And so I think everything that we're going to be talking about today really stems from that original passion and wanting to extend that passion to as many people as possible, which I have a good feeling is probably why a lot of you are here too. So we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff tonight, and I hope that you'll just keep an open mind and an open heart to the ideas that you may receive tonight. Before we dive in too deep, I just want to give a history of kind of the evolution of Grit Fest and All Bikes Welcome. So Grit Fest originally started in 2019. All Bikes Welcome was incorporated as a nonprofit, but we didn't know at the time if we would ever launch it publicly or just keep it as an entity to do business through. It's interesting that at the time we actually thought Grit Fest would be a traveling mountain biking festival. That was really what our dreams for the organization were. But as we'll talk about later, your own dreams don't always align with the needs of your community. And events such as this, especially when we're trying to be inclusive, should first and foremost always be in service of the communities that we're trying to serve. And so things quickly evolved and changed, especially going into the next year, which was COVID-19, the Black Lives Matter movement, and we felt really compelled at the time. Like, we had established this event that we wanted to be a very inclusive and safe space for people from marginalized communities. And we felt very compelled in 2020 to speak up about a lot of social justice issues that were trending, and or a lot of folks were just kind of learning about or really interested in learning about at the time. And that really shifted the way that we showed up in our community, and shifted our ability to connect with different audiences. We did cancel our live of in-person event that year, and instead we had Evening of Grit and some virtual programming. And that was a transformative year for us. Fast forward to the year after that is when we like really turned deeply inward, which, again, I think a lot of the things I'm saying here are also things that are going to come up in this presentation later. Like, we're going to talk about the importance of self-reflection in creative and inclusive environments, including creating inclusive work cultures, etc. And that is really what we did in 2021. We were like, okay, we've created this event, we have this opportunity, but what we really need is a sustainable funding source. We need new leadership. We need diversified marketing assets, just all kinds of things. And I say my team and I, at the time, my team was one other person. We canceled GritFest again, and we really just focused on fundraising. And that is when like the magic happened, and we raised $130,000 to launch All Bikes Welcome to the public as a nonprofit that would serve the communities of Northwest Arkansas specifically. And GritFest would be kind of like the major event of the nonprofit. That's when Rachel Olzer came into the picture. Even though Rachel had been in our community already, they had presented at Evening of Grit back in 2020. And then we had the amazing, wonderful, beautiful opportunity to bring them on as our first full-time executive director. All Bikes Welcome was launched into the world. We hosted our second Grit Fest, and things have just continued to escalate in the most wonderful way. In 2023, we had a huge multi-day Juneteenth celebration. We built community all over the country. I should say Rachel traveled and built community all over the country. Started hosting workshops, and we did our third Grit Fest, and now we're here. We're on this amazing live stream with you all. This is our off-bike education series that we host throughout the year. We have 3 programs that will all begin and kind of peak at GritFest this year. We have our Para-Adaptive program, the Rookie Rider program, and our BIPOC Fellowship program. And then we've also had a successful program certifying some new BICP instructors. So this has been an incredible 6-year journey. We did not get here overnight. I think that's important to note too. Everything that we're going to be talking about is a journey that we've been on since day one, and we're super excited to share with you all. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rachel.
Thank you, Becky, and thanks for that history. As I mentioned in the introduction, I'm Rachel Olzer. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm currently serving as the executive director for All Bikes Welcome and GritFest. And my journey has been a lot more windy in terms of getting here. I started riding bikes a long time ago when I was in high school, and ramped up riding when I was in college, and like many people noticed this lack of diversity around me. And at the time that I was entering college was in 2010. There weren't a lot of conversations, not the way that we have them now, around the lack of diversity in cycling and in the outdoors, and really conversations around lack of diversity kind of on a grander scale. I am a person who my background is in science. Conversations around lack of diversity in science were kind of starting to happen. Conversations around women in STEM, just kind of, I would say generally there was a trend towards, hey, these fields, these spaces really need to look around and make sure that those who aren't here have the tools they need to be here. And I continued to ride, and similar, as Beckie mentioned, being in the outdoors, riding bikes, it changed my life. I loved it. I fell in love with it, and probably like many of you on the live stream or who are watching this later, bikes are such an integral part of how we care for ourselves. And it's been such a great opportunity to find ways to think about bikes beyond just how they help me care for myself, but as a tool for how we create community and how we care for each other. I went on after my undergrad to do a PhD. And again, those conversations around representation and diversity were really starting to get much deeper. And they were moving beyond just, hey, let's celebrate the very few of us that are here, to, hey, how do we get more folks here? What are those barriers? Okay, we're starting to figure out what those barriers are. How do we lower them? Again, not just in cycling, but kind of generally. And, as a Black woman and as a queer Black woman, being in a PhD program was so illuminating for so many reasons, primarily of which had to do with the fact that there are so few Black women and queer Black folks who make it to those levels of education and academia, and not for any fault of their own. And so it was in that time that was shaping so much of my experience of everything, was just becoming so hyper aware that there were so few people that looked like me and that had the experiences that I had in the spaces I was occupying. I was doing my PhD at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, and the time frame that I was in Minneapolis, I spent 6 years of my PhD. The Black Lives Matter movement was ramping up very heavily across the country, but very specifically in Minneapolis. And I, used my bike so much for mental health and for transportation. And at the same time, there was so much police violence that was becoming a really, kind of imminent threat in the city, that was kind of threatening my ability to move through the city in a way that felt safe. And so I started getting really involved in organizing efforts around the Black Lives Matter movement in Minneapolis. And of course, in 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, that was in my backyard. That was in Minneapolis. And it was at that time that I took to social media, and I used, kind of the resources and the knowledge and the voice that I had to really start advocating for, more equity within cycling. And I had already been doing much of that work, but that was when I'd say I really started feeling called to do more of that. Fast forward, I finished my PhD. At that point, I had decided that the best course of action for me was to leave academia. I didn't know what I was going to do, but it was really serendipitous that this organization, kind of came together, and they were looking for leadership, and I was really grateful to have this opportunity to lead. So that's a little bit about me. As far as All Bikes Welcome, we wanted to share kind of the mission and where we're at right now. When the organization first came together in this grant money and fundraising efforts kind of culminated in being able to launch this nonprofit to the public. The initial mission really centered around providing free and low-cost programming in the Northwest Arkansas corridor. And when Beckie and I started working together to shape this mission, it's really, I'd say, gone through several iterations. And, as Beckie mentioned, those iterations are based on what we feel and the feedback we get are the needs of the community as it rapidly evolves. I think what makes us different and where we feel really excited about doing this work is that we have a very intentional intersectional approach, and we'll talk more about that. But we really focus on these areas of marginalization, not just in the communities we are trying to serve, but from, as we say, from the leadership of the organization, who we employ, who serves on our board, who volunteers, all the way to the ridership, who we serve, the participants in our programs. Getting into the more nitty-gritty of kind of inclusive event design, I wanted to take a moment to kind of talk more specifically here, laying the expectation of what we mean by inclusion. I think that's a really big word. It gets used a lot, and I think sometimes it's not always clear. Inclusion encompasses a lot. I mean, the word literally means encompass. So we want to get specific in terms of like what we mean by inclusion. We try to work at the intersections of race, gender, class, and ability. For us, race, Black, Indigenous, people of color, gender, trans men, trans women, cis women, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks. Class, this is cycling. We work with typically working class, middle, and upper class people. That doesn't mean that we don't want to do our best to try to serve low-income folks, but it means that with where we are at this moment, we work primarily to serve working class folks and middle class individuals. And then lastly, ability. We work with able-bodied folks, folks with invisible and physical disabilities. For me, it's really important that we define this because I think for a number of reasons. One, we need to know who we are trying to target when we create programs, when we market, and who we're trying to bring into the community and what we mean by community. And I think two, as an organization, the more we want to be able to serve as many people as possible, but we also need to be realistic about how far we can stretch our mission. And so if we kind of define like these are the places where we're working on inclusion, we can look at where are the places we're not working and how can we get there. Are we able to? Is that something that we as an organization can do? If we're not able to do it, can we look to partner with folks who do that or do it better than we do? Can we point people to resources where they can be served better than we can? Because at the end of the day, we can't do it all. We take, as I said, an intersectional approach, which means that we look not just to serve, somebody who's Black, but somebody who's Black and trans, somebody who's Black, trans, and has a physical disability. We look at identity as something that isn't just these unique boxes that you check, but that your identity is formed based on the intersection of all these marginalizations. Our goal is to serve as many people as possible and as many marginalized people as possible, but using a harm reduction approach. We're not going to get it perfect. We're going to keep trying. Our goal is to do the least amount of harm, but we'll never be able to do no harm at all in all instances because we're going to make mistakes. These are humans building human systems. Okay, getting into the meat of it. The outline that we're going to kind of go off of tonight is this little pyramid. When Beckie and I sat down to work on this talk, we realized there's just so many aspects of inclusive event design that we could cover. We could talk about the physical environment. We can talk about all that goes into just planning an event. We can talk about all that goes in afterwards. I mean, this could be multi-part series. We decided with our expertise and our experience, it would be best if we focus on thinking about those aspects of event design before the event is even happening. So tonight we'll talk about all four of these aspects. We lay it out like this because we really believe that building trust is truly the foundation. And I know that seems kind of cliche, but it really is the most important piece of inclusion work. Building trust is that first piece that's going to get you into the direction of having a more inclusive event. Establishing values, communicating those values. How do you get from, okay, we want to serve Black, trans, non-binary folks. Now, how do we communicate that those are the folks we want to serve? How do we communicate that our values are ones that align with inclusion and equity? And then lastly, soliciting feedback and responding to that feedback from your community. So, as I mentioned, building trust is the first point of action that we believe makes an event more inclusive and gets you in the direction of doing this work in a way that is helpful and sustainable. I really like this quote. I've heard it in different spaces. Relationships are built at the speed of trust, and social change happens at the speed of relationships. We talk about it all the time, like relationship building, community building, building trust. And the reason that is so important is because we need to know who we can call when, for lack of better terms, shit hits the fan. For us, we think, bikes are great. This is such great work we're doing to build community in bikes, but there's a deeper purpose served here beyond just cycling and having fun. If we're not taking the time to build relationships, build trust, social change is basically not possible in our eyes. I'd be remiss to say, if I missed out on saying this, but building trust takes a lot of time. I think that's one of those things when I'm having conversations with people and they want to have more diversity at their events and they want their events to be more inclusive, and you start talking with folks and you're kind of getting to the heart of like, well, how much have you done? How long have you been doing this? And I think, and you find out that it's only like a couple months, or maybe they've only been at this a year or two and they're not seeing the results that they want to see. It takes so long to get to where you're physically seeing in pictures that diversity that you're looking for. And it's because building trust takes so much time, and it's going to take a lot of just showing up over and over before you even get to where people are starting to invite you in. Just stick with it. It really is worth it. I often, as I said, I often have conversations with folks who are event organizers, and they want to do great work. They want their event or organization to have more diversity. They want more Black and brown people at their event. They're wondering, why does my event look the way it does? And these are great questions to start with. It's certainly, it's much better than like sitting around and just assuming that everything's good. And it's definitely better than not being willing to have those conversations. But my mind always first goes to, when I hear these conversations, when I hear these questions, is what are marginalized people getting out of this? Like, you want marginalized people at your event, but why should they want to be there? So I always kind of try to approach it of like shifting that mindset. So instead of asking, how do I get marginalized folks to support the work I'm doing? Because ultimately that's what event participation is, right? It's people supporting the work you're doing. It's doing something for you. Instead, shifting your thinking towards, how do I support the work that marginalized folks are doing? How do I support the work that's already out there? Ideally, that's going to get you to your end goal of having more marginalized folks at your event, but it's a really good trust building exercise to shift from what can I get out of this to what can I do for you? And that doesn't have to be this extractive or exchange in real time happening. It can be a sort of like, oh, there's XYZ event happening that's led by this organization that I don't have any connection to. Let me go to the event, or let me sign up to volunteer. Let me start building the bridge across and start having those conversations. Hey, like, I really like what you're doing over here. We also have this event and I think you'd really like it. Maybe check it out sometime. Now, keep in mind that trust building takes time. You showing up one time and volunteering or, offering your support does not mean that people are going to immediately show up. Again, you've got to keep showing up, and you've got to keep showing up even when it's uncomfortable. That's so important. And I think for a lot of marginalized folks, particularly I'll speak for like a lot of Black and brown folks, it really is about just like who keeps showing up, who is just there, who speaks up when it's not popular, who's around when it's not trending. Those things, like, we remember those things. Those things matter to us. So it really is just a take your time, approach this as if you're going to be doing this work for a while, because you are.
All right, we're going to talk about the next level on that pyramid that Rachel showed us. We had building trust at the very bottom, and then the next level is establishing values. And I want to talk about our values in 3 layers, beginning with our personal values, because your personal values and your personal convictions are ultimately what is going to exude out into the culture that you're building with your teams, and then also like what you put out to the public in terms of the event that you're trying to design. And so personal values, there's a million places to start here. In my personal experience at the time, and still, I am a cisgender, straight, white woman from a middle-class background. I didn't grow up around a lot of diversity, and working in outdoor education at that time, there was definitely not a lot of diversity. And so I had a ton of self-education to do and a ton of learning and unlearning. I thankfully had like a very close friend at the time who we were like able to hold each other accountable and like have these really difficult conversations and like gently call each other out and like, hey, I think that's like your ego getting in the way, or that's like your conditioning or your white fragility, your patriarchal mindset, like whatever it was. We had this like established rapport and relationship where we really could have these conversations with each other and learn and unlearn so many things in the process. And it was definitely through that that I built some pretty strong personal values and convictions. If you're not sure where to start identifying your personal values, I'm a huge fan of journaling, which is why I've put some reflection prompts here. There's tons of science that journaling, whether you're a good writer or not, actually like helps you process emotions and feelings and move through them and come to conclusions. And so, sit down with your journal expect that no one's going to read it and you can write whatever it is that you need to say, and really challenge yourself. Like, give yourself some gut checks. Like, why do I want to bring other people to my event? Is it in service of my own ego? Is it because I want to make more money? Or is it because I genuinely desire to serve diverse communities? And so that's where we start, is like digging down deep, uncovering the ego that's inside of us, and coming up with these personal reflections and convictions. Then we can start to move to like our team or our work culture values. Again, I think this is a super important layer to have established, because it's what is going to exude out at your events and at your programs. You need to know that your team is on the same page, and when you're not there leading them, you can trust that they're upholding the same values as you are as well. So this can look a lot of different ways. Again, there's not like a perfect formula to do this stuff. I highly recommend having one-on-one conversations, especially if like there are people on your team who maybe are already interested in trying to be more inclusive and have more progressive values and convictions. Starting to have one-on-one conversations with them and talk through these reflection prompts with them, and you'll start to come up with ways that you can just be more inclusive at your work site. Like, do you include pronouns on your Zoom calls? Do you have different accommodations for dietary restrictions at company events? Like, there's so many things that you can do to start to like tiptoe into inclusion. And then people they start to ask questions and get curious of like why we're doing this. And then you have an opportunity to like gently educate them, if you need to go to that level, to sort of usher them along in this inclusivity journey. And then when they feel ready, you can start to facilitate these conversations around your team and work values, and how you can all start to work collectively to become more inclusive. Then we get to what we're here to talk about. Yeah, Rachel, did you want to add something?
I wanted to hear your thoughts about that third point, the have I consulted with somebody. I have thoughts, and I also want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think anytime we're working with marginalized communities or nonprofit work in general, like, we always want to consult with the people that we want to serve. We don't ever want to assume that we understand what they need. And so whether that looks like paying consultants or doing community feedback surveys, there's some different ways to do it, but I think this is a super important part. And you can do it for so many things at a place of work. You don't just have to consult people on an event that you want to create. You can consult them on pay equity. You can consult them on time off policies. You can consult them on maternity leave, right? Like, there's a million things that we can bring folks from marginalized communities into the conversations around. And Rachel, I would love to know what you want to add to that.
Yeah, that's really good. I just really like that point. When I was reading that, it makes me think about the ways in which, particularly in the spaces of outdoor recreation, we do often assume that BIPOC folks or trans folks like want to be here, and sometimes that's true. We obviously know that's true, that there's a lack of access that many people want to have, and also I think it's okay to give somebody an opportunity to ride bikes for the first time, and for them to say, like, that was great, but this isn't for me. I think sometimes there's a conflation of like, if we bring people into this space, they have to want to stay in this space. And I think there's a difference between they don't want to be in this space because because there's something that is happening in the space that is not comfortable or not appropriate or not safe, versus this was really cool, but I don't really like biking any, this isn't for me, or like camping is just not for me. And this, I love that we're in the spirit of like, the outdoors is for everyone. The outdoors is for everyone. And the outdoors also, not everybody has to be in it. And that's okay too. As long as folks have the opportunities and the access, and the barriers are not what is preventing them from being there. So that's what my mind went as well, thinking about that. And then I really like that you brought up that marginalized folks can be consulted on things that aren't just related to DEI. Because at the end of the day, all our whole lives are shaped by our identities and how we move through the world. So other things that aren't directly related to your organization's DEI policy can be a place where marginalized folks have a voice. And so, yeah, I just appreciated that and wanted to call attention to that.
Absolutely. Thanks for jumping in. Okay. And finally, our event values. This is where we can get like a little bit more tactical in our approach to being inclusive. Maybe the first thing we start with here is we look at the event and we think about all the people we want to invite in, and you make a literal list of barriers that might prevent those people from joining. And then there's like a million different approaches that you can take to start removing those barriers. Be graceful with yourself. You're not going to be able to remove them all at once. Like we've said multiple times already, GritFest has done a ton of work to remove barriers for people with different marginalized identities, but we're still doing more all of the time. And we're certainly doing way more than we were in years 1 and 2. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on because I'm looking at the time. Want to talk about values?
Yeah, we thought about when we were thinking about how do we go from establishing values on to just what's next. We thought about like, there's kind of these two parts to values. There's this internal part that comes with your company culture, your organization's culture, how you work as a team, how are you training your team to be out in the community. And then there's this external part of your values of how do you communicate to the public what your values are. And we landed on talking a bit about like marketing and marketing around your values. Marketing, obviously, we know marketing is important. That's why we put a lot of money into marketing, and we know that it's often that first point of contact with the public. But we often think about marketing as a way to communicate our values externally, and a way to make it known where we stand and why.
All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about what messages you're using to appeal to your audience. And a theme that's going to show up here, it's already been mentioned once, is specificity. And what I really like about this word cloud is like some of the words you see here show just how specific we get when we're talking about GritFest specifically. Some examples from the cycling scene that I think do a good job of calling out who their events are for and being vocal about who they're making space for. One is Grounded Nebraska. They use the phrase community-centric gravel race, ride, and festival. This immediately tells me that like race while it's still mentioned, is kind of on the back burner to like building community and riding bikes together and having a fun time. When you go to their Instagram, on the very top, there's like 2 equality flags. There's people wearing tie-dye. There's people with the trans flag wristbands and bubbles. Like it looks like it's going to be this like fun, inclusive atmosphere that also includes riding bikes. And then when you go to their website, you just get even more of that. They're like they hit you with the summer camp vibes and the ride, race, or party pace, and cycling is for everyone. And they write out more about those values and what that means to them. Another one is Rome Fest. I think one thing I really appreciate Rome Fest is they're like super clear about who this is for. It's a femme and women's mountain bike festival for everybody. The vibe is a little different, right? They're like fun as hell. Best 3 days of my 2 years on this planet. No shit. Like, you know that when you're going to this event, like it is going to be a party. So when we're talking about communicating your values, there's a lot of different ways that you can do this really clearly in your digital marketing assets. And so we've included a list here. I also want to say that like no one expects you to have all of this within even a year. Gritfest and All Bikes Welcome, we don't have all of this. It's like this is a process that takes iterating and going through that pyramid of like building trust, establishing values, communicating those values, soliciting feedback, and then you start over and you're just like constantly working through this pyramid, right? So a statement of inclusivity, be super clear on your website, get specific about who is invited to this event. A code of conduct or a community agreement, we have these, and I think Paola's going to drop a link in the chat to the ones that we have established for Gritfest. An anti-discrimination policy. If you're going to be inviting people from marginalized communities to your event, you should also have some sort of zero tolerance for discrimination policy, and it should be communicated what level of recourse will be taken if people violate that policy. It's also good to have like an internal team meeting about how to handle those situations. Accessibility information. So if you're working with people with physical disabilities and or cognitive disabilities, then including information on physical access, sensory considerations, support services available. You could even put like dietary restrictions, allergies, those sorts of things can go in here as well. And then, because that's information that they're going to need to determine whether or not they should come to your event. You can also include like contact information for someone to make a specific request, or if they need to call and ask about a specific accommodation. Feedback forms on your website. This is just another way to like continue that feedback loop. Featuring the work of marginalized folks in your community. We talked about this earlier when we were talking about building trust. Like, it's not just about inviting them, being like, hey, come to our event, check it out. We think you'd really love it. But it's also about like showing up to the work that's being done in the community already by members of those communities, supporting their work, elevating and amplifying their work. And continuing to show up beyond just like when it's cool to be there. And then, of course, inclusive language. We don't want to make assumptions about people's identities or experiences within our language, and then also diverse representation in visuals. A few more examples here. So Gritfest, I mean, this is really, we don't call it our statement of inclusivity, but this is on the website in multiple places. It's the first thing you read about Gritfest is that it's a 3-day community building event for trans men and women, cis women, and non-binary folks of all abilities and backgrounds. It's one of the few for us, by us events. So if you come to GritFest, you're going to see folks with marginalized identities in positions of leadership, and working and presenting workshops, leading group rides, etc. We aim to set the standard for inclusion in the cycling industry. And then our goal is to create an environment where you feel safe to learn and grow on and off the bike and be comfortable to be your whole self. Community agreements, we linked these in the comments. Thank you, Paula. And then this is our anti-discrimination policy that you can read through. It says, like, in order to keep this space safe, we will not tolerate any harassment, transphobia, homophobia, racism, xenophobia, bike shaming, or non-consensual touch. We encourage all participants to practice sharing pronouns, consent, and body neutrality. GritFest supports the Black Lives Matter fight for justice and equity. And we have, before GritFest, we have established team meetings about, like, we create communication protocols that people can report to us if they experience any of these forms of harassment or discrimination. And then we also have protocols about what to do when someone has reported an incident like this. Alrighty, back to you, Rachel.
Thank you. That was so good. I am going to talk now a bit more about when we communicate our values in non-verbal ways, and thinking kind of more specifically about the visual representation of your values. Two big questions to think about that kind of guide this is, how does your marketing imagery convey your values, and who and what is and is not represented in your imagery. Imagery, as probably most of you know, has evolved quite a bit. In the time when I think back to when I was starting out cycling, looking for resources, social media was in its infancy. Kind of generally, like, just social media was, I don't know, Instagram was like the Wild West. Like, it was just not used in the ways that it is now by large companies and organizations to market. But as it evolved, we started to see imagery used in ways that, for better or worse, communicated an organization's values. I always, when I come across a new page, a page I followed, an account that maybe I haven't followed, but I'm interested in what they do, I like to play a game of seeing how far down I have to scroll before I see a person of color, before I see somebody in a body that's not an able-bodied person, before I see any fat representation, just kind of getting a gauge of, like, what that looks like. Historically, that before 2020, when we all started realizing that representation was important, it was frequently that you would have to scroll very far before you saw anything, or that you would have pages that there wasn't representation of any diversity. And it's really great to see that that's changing. We want to, of course, avoid any tokenization, and we'll talk more about that through the imagery. But, if your event is in the process of becoming more inclusive and more diverse, you're only going to have, kind of initially, you might only have like one or two people of color. And that's okay, because you're working towards it. What you want to avoid is taking as many pictures of those few folks of color that you have there and plastering them everywhere. That not only is extremely deceptive because your event doesn't look like that, it's really disrespectful for the folks that do come and support your event. It becomes this very extractive relationship. And it really, as somebody who's had that happen to them, it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. And quite frankly, marginalized folks can see through that quite easily. So you definitely don't want to do things like that. As I said, imagery has evolved quite a bit. I'm right now on your screen, you're looking at GritFest, the first GritFest and the imagery from that, and the last GritFest, last two GritFests, some photos from that. And I share these not to shame Beckie and the work she's done, but to show us as an example of ways in which our imagery has evolved as well. The photos above from the first GritFest, people look like they're having fun. It's a great event, but on the whole, it's not particularly diverse in obvious ways. You don't see a lot of racial diversity necessarily. There aren't people in different bodies. Versus now, based on a lot of the work that we have done, we've been able to pull more diversity into the event, and our imagery represents what we're seeing at our events. We really don't have to work too hard to come up with diverse imagery because our event looks like what we want it to, what our event looks like, what it looks like on social media. There's not a lot of necessarily deception happening there.
Can I add something, Rachel?
Of course, yeah.
I was just gonna say, to highlight again, like the time that it takes to build trust and bring people from marginalized communities into your event. Like, there was a lot of effort to make GritFest inclusive at the very first one, and still it was like majority white, thin, cis women. There were also a lot of queer women. That was like kind of the one thing that everyone was like, oh yeah, obviously, but like everything else took a lot of time. And I think it's just like, it's such a beautiful illustration of like what can happen if you stay the course too.
Thank you. Yeah, it's super helpful to have that perspective as well. I want to also point out in the imagery and in diverse imagery and the ways that you communicate your values, this being, we're a cycling organization, an outdoor organization. I think we have a tendency to really want to highlight the ultra, like, rugged experiences of participants at our events, which is so cool. This photo gives me chills. It's one of the coolest photos. We have this fabulous rider, Michaela, jumping this truck. I mean, it's so badass. It's so cool. And it's super great to have that. And we've used that. But we also know that that is not the majority of our participants. The majority of our participants are not going to be doing anything like this. And while we want to celebrate that some of our participants can do this, we also want to celebrate that some of our participants are not. And that's okay. And so having just very like normal, chill rides, imagery of just like having fun, having it be very laid back, that's also our vibe, especially because we want to invite folks in who have never been on a mountain bike. As cool as an image like this is to us, to those of us who are part of this community, this is an image that is very daunting to somebody who's never been on a mountain bike. And when I talk to folks who've never been on a mountain bike and I'm saying, you should come to GritFest and try out mountain biking, like just come and try it. And if you hate it, you never have to do it again. This is what almost 99% of the time, this is what they think mountain biking is. And that's part of the reason they haven't gotten on a mountain bike, because this is terrifying to a lot of people. So having that imagery that's like, hey, it's just somebody riding their bike. Like, it's just somebody, the wheels are on the ground, they're smiling, they're having fun. That's awesome too. And we have, of course, other things happening at our event that aren't bikes. And so we also do a lot of work around highlighting that it's more than just the bike at GritFest. So similar to Grounded, right? There's folks making friendship bracelets. There's just meals being had. Folks are just hanging out and laughing. We love bikes and we want, to have that be part of the event, but we also just want people there having fun, laughing, and enjoying themselves in an authentic way in a space that maybe they've never been able to be a part of or never seen themselves a part of.
I also love that last photo, Rachel, that the rider is just wearing the clothes that they had as opposed to some really expensive cycling apparel. It was like a cotton t-shirt. I love that. Okay. Continuing on about communicating your values, and what are some things that you can do to communicate your values if you don't currently have diverse participation? And we would say get vocal. There, now more than ever, we are so aware of the different issues that different communities face every single day. Or I should say, we have the opportunity to be aware. A lot of us also have the privilege to not be aware. And if you are going to work with marginalized communities, it's important to recognize too that those people don't have the privilege to not be aware of all of the issues and barriers that they face, systemic oppression that they face day in and day out, especially here in the US, but honestly all over the globe. And one of the ways that you can show your community that, you know, you really and truly are welcome here is by saying that, like, hey, we care enough to be like really vocal about this issue that affects you. And there's a thoughtful way to do this too, right? Like at All Bikes Welcome, Paula and Rachel, they've got a marketing calendar and they've got all these important days that they know they want to speak up about issues marked, and they are planning months in advance about the content and the messages that they're going to put out into the world. That allows us to like show up consistently with this voice, but then it also creates some space so that when there is like a crisis situation or a geopolitical situation or a social justice issue that rises, and we feel like we feel very moved and like we would like to respond within the moment, that also gives us the space to do that as well, because we're not just constantly in this like reactionary phase. Yes, Rachel.
Can you go back one slide? I wanted to say I appreciate you bringing up the amount that we plan for these things. I think it's a cautionary tale. I see it from brands and organizations frequently that they want to do these kinds of things. They want to engage in a post or some kind of marketing around Martin Luther King Day or Black History Month, and they don't take the time, or, you know, I don't want to assume what they're doing, but what ends up happening, they haven't planned it out, they haven't calendared out, it's not part of their marketing strategy, so they end up scrambling. And it's in that trust building, it degrades a lot of trust when a brand is approaching folks of color last minute to create content for them. It's happened to me several times. One thing to note is, like, if you are a prominent marginalized person in this community, you get approached to do free work constantly, and you have to navigate that. And on top of that, when it's, oh, you've clearly not thought about this, like you have 2 weeks till Black History Month and you're just approaching me, that doesn't work for me. I don't have that kind of time to give to you. And also I can see that this isn't really important to you because you're not planning for it. So it's really important that if this has become, that you want to make this a part of your strategy, if this is something that you value doing, and not just reacting in the moment.
Amazing. So I've got a couple examples. I'm not sure if they're large enough for you to read them, but I can kind of call out a few things. I want to say also, you know, we were talking about establishing your values, and we had that target of like your personal values, your team values, and your event values. Something like this, speaking out about these types of issues or moments, is really a team effort on most of us who work for All Bikes Welcome. Like, we take turns writing these responses or creating these posts, and some of them, like, a ton of time goes into, like, the 3 ways to celebrate Black History Month as a cycling enthusiast, and the one below it, which was the MLK Junior Day, that had like an amazing playlist that came along with it. A lot of time and intention went into those. And then our Thanksgiving post from last year, which is in the top right here, like that again was planned out in advance. And then some of you on this call I'm sure, are aware of like the tornado that hit Northwest Arkansas this summer. And because our team, we're all on the same page about our values and our convictions, we're able to really quickly pull together a response that we felt like was representative of who we are as an organization and how we wanted to show up for our community. And that's when we made this post on the bottom right here, disaster relief resources. And so, taking that time to establish your values and like really cultivating those values within your team. Again, everything just exudes out to what the public sees. And I think that's like one of the reasons All Bikes Welcome is so effective at showing up in this way. Rachel, would you like to add anything to this?
Yeah, I wanted to say a couple things. One being that for us, it's really fun. Like when Paula and I sit down and it's like, I get excited about Black History Month. Obviously, like I'm Black, I love Black History Month. So we also, it's like we're sitting down and we're thinking about like, what's a really cool way that we can celebrate this month and add something to the conversation. Same with like the MLK Day playlist. I had so much fun putting that together. It was just such a unique way to add to the conversation, to put something out there that maybe wouldn't have been out there. And so I think it's really important to think about the ways that you add to the conversation and not detract from the conversations or from what's happening. And so in that spirit, when we sit down, at the end of the year and start calendaring out the next year and thinking about where we're going to post and what we want to do and how we want to communicate our values, we aren't posting about everything all the time. We are very strategic about where do we want to post and where do we want to maybe not create our own content, but just share content from other people, highlight other organizations. On Trans Day of Visibility, there are other organizations who need a lot of support and need more resources and are doing deep interventions for trans folks. So that's an opportunity for us to share in our stories those organizations, those resources that are out there and direct the conversations over there. And so I think that's another way that you can start to move in that direction. If you're not ready to make posts, the share button, that stuff only lasts 24 hours. And it can have a big impact if you have a large following. It can have a big impact on small grassroots organizations who need support, and at the same time accomplish your mission of communicating your values of inclusion and equity. And so I want to call attention to that as well.
That reminded me of another point, Rachel, that we talked about in preparation for this presentation, which was there's kind of a trend sometimes on some of these days. An organization makes a post and they're like, here's 10 Black cyclists that you should follow. And then they tag 10 cyclists that they don't have a relationship with, have never talked to, don't amplify or support their work. And that can feel like, I don't want to speak for Black cyclists, Rachel, so correct me if I'm wrong, but like what I've heard from listening to cyclists or influencers or organizations that this happens to is that that's like very isolating and tokenizing. Like, please don't tag me to add clout to your post.
Yeah, thank you. It comes across very disingenuous. Again, it's that relationship building. Build a relationship with somebody that, that you are genuinely interested in having a relationship with, and see where that can take you. If that's what, if you're wanting to highlight other folks. I also want to say in that vein, that when you start to become more vocal on social media, we've all seen it. If you've never done that before, it can become very volatile very quickly. So it's really important to prime your audiences, and have a strategy and a plan for how you're going to deal with comments, how you're going to deal with story posts, all of that. There really is no reason in my mind that hateful comments, especially when you're highlighting folks of color or Black folks or marginalized folks, when you're tagging them, there is no reason those should be just staying there unresponded to, unmoderated. You have to be in those comments. We are lucky and privileged enough that we've done enough of this work. People know where we stand. We don't encounter that as much, but when we enter new territories, like we've run ads on Facebook, we have come across that, and we've had to, as a team, get together and talk about like, ooh, these comments are, how do we want to deal with this? What's our policy? Are we responding? Are we deleting those comments? Like, what do we want to do? Because those do cause harm when people see those.
It goes back to that, like, showing up when it's not cool or it's super uncomfortable, right? Like, if I interview and write a blog about a trans cyclist and feature them on my organization's page, and then people are coming under that and saying horrible, awful, transphobic things in the comments, and I just dip and I don't protect that person who's like been vulnerable for the sake of my organization, like, that's your building trust efforts are going to backslide grossly, and also you're going to do a lot of harm to that person. So and then I'm going to bring Rachel back in on this one. Like, again, just, are you vocal when it matters? And maybe if you're just entering your inclusivity journey and just learning to become vocal about social justice issues, you're probably not going to start with like global geopolitical issues. But we would challenge you to, like, you're going to come across these concepts of like collective liberation and justice and equity, and you're going to start to learn and see how all of these movements, they all either work together for better or for worse. And so you'll have to kind of like expand your thinking of like, okay, how far are we willing to go for this fight, and how much are we willing to speak out about? Rachel, would love for you to add on to this here, because I know you'd have some valuable insights.
Yeah, I think, it's very clear where we stand on things because we make it known. I personally really hate the trend towards like forcing folks to make statements. I don't think that that's helpful, and that's me personally. I think if an organization chooses to make a statement, that's a positive, but being forced in the direction of saying something, I don't think is necessary. And I think we don't respond to every crisis, because we would never get work done. We'd never be able to do anything other than responding. Unfortunately, that's where we are, right? Like, something is always happening that negatively affects marginalized people. And that in and of itself is so sad and challenging to have to navigate, right? I think it really takes a conversation oftentimes between our core leadership team about when, like when we're going to say something and when we're not. And it's very rarely that we're not saying something because we're afraid of any kind of backlash. It's more like, one of us is, hey, I feel like we really got to say something. Like, I feel compelled, like this is affecting my ability to work, because I don't feel comfortable with the fact that we're just going about our lives. Like, we got to say something here. And so it's really typically something like that. I think sometimes you're going to get it wrong. Sometimes you're going to get it wrong, and that's okay too. Trust is a two-way street. And yes, folks who are not marginalized, like for instance, if white folks, you have more trust building to do in the direction of building trust with communities of color, but also, expect that trust can be a two-way street, and that sometimes you're going to get it wrong, and you can trust that folks are going to let you know, and that you're going to do better next time, and that you can continue on and do better in the future. So yeah, I think, I that's what I want to say about that. Is there something else I should say? Okay, cool. Okay, so the top of our pyramid, the last thing that we feel is really important when thinking about designing events in a more inclusive and equitable way is soliciting feedback. This probably seems pretty obvious. Like, you need to know where you're getting it wrong and where you're getting it right. But I think it's really important to expect feedback regularly and welcome it. It is very human to get defensive because you worked really hard at something. I implore you to remember that if people are giving you feedback, consider it a blessing. It means they trust you enough to share, and it's an opportunity for improvement. When somebody is telling you, like, hey, you kind of missed the mark on this, they're not saying your whole event is trash and you should, burn or anything like that. What they're saying is, I like what you're doing here enough to tell you that in order for me to come back, I want to see this differently. It takes a lot of courage to tell people what isn't working for them. For marginalized people in particular, because they are folks who hold less power, it takes a lot to speak up. Even if it's anonymous, it takes a lot to say something. So consider it a blessing. Collect data on the experiences of everyone involved in your event, from participants, volunteers, staff, anybody involved in your event. Get that feedback, collect data on that. We at All Bikes Welcome, we really value both that quantitative, those numbers-based data, like what are the demographic breakdowns of who's at the event or who's participating, but also that qualitative data, like what are those words? What are people saying? And we use that. It's really helpful both internally as we look at, okay, yeah, we really crushed it when it came to, having support and representation from this group of folks. But when we look at the numbers, man, we really need to do more when it comes to outreach and trust building with these other groups, because we're not seeing these folks at our event. And we use that qualitative data internally as well when we're thinking about, like, hey, people really raved about this one aspect of the event. Like, we really got to make sure we keep that. Or, what I heard was like, that wasn't really working for people. So we got to figure out a way to change that. And then lastly, when it comes to data, it's so important to communicate with folks how that data is going to be used and who's going to see it, both internally and externally. So, there's so much evidence of the ways that data collected on and from marginalized people has been abused. And that oftentimes makes folks, particularly like Black folks, trans folks, it makes folks not want to give feedback often or share data. or have data collected on them because it hasn't been protected in a way or used in a respectful way. So we are, at All Bikes Welcome, we're talking a lot now about like communicating how are the data going to be used when they're collected and who's going to see that data. Also keep in mind, I used to come up against this a lot in grad school. I was in a large department, but I was, for a long time, I was the only Black woman in that department. And so when I would give feedback, they were going to know who was saying it because, it was very obvious. And so it made it really hard to want to share feedback, even anonymously, because it really wasn't anonymous. Like they were going to know, they could put 2 and 2 together. And so as you're starting to do this work, that's probably going to come up. And that's okay. But I think the more you can do ahead of that to say, hey, we're collecting data to understand participant experiences at our event. We use this data to help us in the planning process. These data won't be shared externally. Easy peasy. Or, hey, we're collecting data on the participant experience. We want to use these to make our event better. We also use these and share these with funders in order to help get more funding to support our events in the future. Beckie, did you have anything you wanted to say about feedback? Because I know you have, you're big on the data collection.
No, I mean, I love data. I love Brene Brown says that like data is a storytelling technique, or it's like a story in numbers or something like that, which I think is such a beautiful way to think of it. But no, I think if anything, like I can just speak from the perspective of like a white event organizer who has come up against a lot of, not come up against, who has received a lot of feedback, and like the emotional roller coaster that can feel like sometimes. And it's just to reiterate what Rachel's saying, it's just a matter of like a reframe, right? It's like, this person's not attacking me. They took the time to share a valuable insight about how I can make this event better. And when you're first starting this work, there's going to be a lot of that. But yeah, I think that's all I would say, is to like not be discouraged. And the feedback never stops coming. And it's like a really beautiful thing too, when you can learn to take that feedback and not take it personally and just like move on and be better too.
Yeah. And not to get too like therapy here, but it builds so much trust when somebody gives you feedback and you accept it well, and you listen to it and you say like, thank you for sharing that. Like, let me see what I can do. Or like, we're going to do better in the future. I appreciate you taking the time. There's so much trust built in the feedback process, and it goes such a long way. And conversely, there's a lot of trust that can be broken when somebody gives you feedback and you get defensive, or you don't handle it well, or you don't receive it well. Not only does that make somebody not want to take your feedback, but it conveys a message that you're only in this work for the self-gratification of people telling you you're doing good work. If that's why you're in this, get out of it now, because this isn't going to be that. If you really are invested in the process of building more inclusivity in the world, this isn't for the self-gratification of hearing like how great your work is. This is to do the best that we can do. And I think that is where I really just want to end things. Remind you that you're going to make mistakes in this work, and that's okay. I make mistakes all the time. Just because I'm a Black, queer, gender nonconforming woman doesn't mean that I'm somehow immune and have all of the answers for how to make all inclusivity possible and all marginalized folks feel included. Like, I'm going to get it wrong a lot, and that's okay. we're not here to get it right. We're here to grow, and we're here to build something better for the future. It's just an ongoing process, and we just keep trying. Beckie, is there anything else you want to say?
No, I don't think so. It's just, we keep moving and keep trying.
Exactly. And with that, we would love to start the live Q&A. Please feel free to drop any questions. And truly about anything, like we're an open book, so this is your chance to ask questions that you have.
I can maybe, Rachel, share one more thing if folks are like typing questions right now, just in terms of soliciting feedback. Something that was coming to mind was when we started GritFest, one thing my co-founder and I talked about a lot was like not judging how people delivered feedback and not hiding behind this smokescreen of like professionalism or being polite. And that especially when it comes to like marginalized communities, it's whatever way they're willing to offer feedback was the way that we should be willing to accept it. And so hard, so challenging when you are socialized your entire life to believe that like politeness and professionalism are these things that should be valued, when in reality they're just smoke screens to exclude people from conversations. But yeah, I think that's something that folks can keep in mind too, is like sometimes the feedback comes at you in a way that you're not expecting it, and it's also beautiful to just be able to roll with it.
I really like that. Yes. And feedback is hard. Like I've had to really grow. I like have gotten defensive in the past and broken trust. And it really is just like, but you keep showing up and you just commit to doing a little bit better each time. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think I have a question for you, Beckie, which is, as you've seen the event grow and evolve, how has the exchange been for you between like that internal work you've had to do to kind of let go of like, what you kind of envisioned or what your values might be or what you wanted, or any of that kind of like, what is that self part of it? How have you kind of managed with that?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, I think on a very basic level, like the beginning of my journey of like wanting to create an inclusive event, it was very like tactical in terms of like, I need to understand white supremacy. I need to understand patriarchy. I need to understand, I'm trying to like, transphobia. I need to understand the issues that like queer people face. Like it was very like, almost just like a checklist. And then there was kind of this like a couple of years of like awakening to systemic oppression, and then this shifting point to like I want to say like aspiring abolitionist, because I think like it's like always a journey, not a place that you arrive. But yeah, and then that's like there's so much more internal work and like ego death that goes into that compared to just this like I took this like very scholarly analytical approach to it at the beginning, which is how I do everything. And so that's been like a big transition. And then I would say, and I think I see this with nonprofit founders a lot, is that it takes time to, especially when you're like handing over leadership, it takes time to release and realize that like you need to let the organization evolve so that it can best serve the communities that it was meant to serve, as opposed to like wanting to hang on and like make sure that it's like these concepts of like, oh, that's my baby, oh, that's my life's work. Like you eventually, if you like really and truly are in the nonprofit space as a founder, you have to shed those layers because they're not in service of your community. And that is hard. And I feel really lucky to have you at the helm and like our working relationship, but definitely like I've seen it in myself and I see it in other founders who I work with who they desire to support marginalized communities, but there can be kind of that like, you've got your like claws synced into this thing that you created, and how do you release and let the organization and go and serve who it was created to serve.
Thank you for that. I think that's really valuable insight. And I want to say before we get to this question that it's really inspiring, I think, to watch us. I mean, I say us, like watch you and watch us like navigate that, and like what does that look like to transition, and also remind folks I hold deeply a value of mine that longevity is not a measure of success. Something can be very successful and not last forever. That applies to what I said earlier, like folks can try biking once and decide it's not for them, and that doesn't make it an unsuccessful experience. As long as we've done as much as we can to lower the barriers of access and make it something safe and accessible to somebody, they can also still choose to say this isn't for me, and that doesn't make it unsuccessful. And similarly with, an organization, like it can start out being one thing and evolve to something else. And Beckie and I and our team are in constant communication about our goal is not to do a specific thing. Our goal is to evolve with the needs of the community and whatever those might be. And that allows us to think more long-term, but it also allows us to not have, to not be bound to holding tightly to some idea of this is what it has to be. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Patty says, would you ever consider checking out people's nonprofits and give live feedback on their website? It helps help them grow. Yeah. Well, Beckie, you can speak to this maybe a bit more.
Probably. I mean,
we've talked about doing stuff like that and like are open to it in the future. Obviously right now we're pretty busy running this thing. The way I do kind of see that in the long term is like we very much, I'd say, internally at All Bikes Welcome have an ethos of like everything is for learning. Like we should not expect to get anything right all the time. And so, I kind of see the work we're doing at All Bikes Welcome as a test for like, does this work? Does this not work? Like, how do we keep pushing the boundaries of what inclusion looks like? And so the more we do that, hopefully that's setting a precedent, but also a tone and a direction for the industry. And, we'd love for others to learn from what we're doing. How do external groups find it? They're always welcome to email us, Rachel Olzer at Gmail, info at Grit Festival, Beckie at Grit Festival. We would love to help you or talk to you. Again, we're not, I wouldn't say by any means that we have all the answers for you. I'm a pretty open book. I will say that, be ready to have those conversations, because I try not to shy away from telling you the real answers. But yeah, I'm always happy to talk. Beckie, I don't know. Beckie is a consultant, so she may be able to help you in other ways.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. Like Beckie at gritfestival.com. If you want to reach out to us on behalf of like working with Gritfest or All Bikes Welcome and doing some like consulting work. And then I write grants for this kind of work all day, every day. And so if it's ever a situation where you're like, I really want to start this program to support people from this community, I take like 30-minute discovery calls and we could talk about what it would look to try and get that funded for you. Not to like plug my business, but that is what I do for a living, if that's something that anyone here needs.
Plug your business. Get it in there. B says, as a marginalized athlete, how do you manage the emotional challenges when your values clash with those of major race events that seem resistant to change? What's the best way to give feedback to them? This is a really, really good question, and I really appreciate your vulnerability in asking. I have a few thoughts, and then Beckie, I would love to hear your thoughts as well. I think this happens a lot, and because the unfortunate thing that it happens a lot is that people are affected. The flip side of that, in that it happens a lot, is that you have folks that you can go to talk to that aren't the race director or the event organizer. There are other people who almost certainly have either had experiences with that particular event or similar ones that you can get advice from, you can vent to, you can find solace in and community with, and come together and find ways. And oftentimes, when we think about grassroots organizing, that's what it is. It's usually like, hey, I had this experience. And then you start talking to people and they're like, I had this experience too. And you find the power in that community to come together as a unit to address that issue. I mean, that's what all social movements are, right? It's like people come together and say, like, we're stronger together addressing this than we are as individuals. So that is one approach. Obviously, that takes time. That is, you're not guaranteed to find a large group of people to go to that organizer or to do something about that, that issue with. My other thought is, I was just having a conversation with a friend today, and we were kind of reminiscing on the ways that this work, this DEI work, has evolved so much in the very short amount of time that both of us have been in these spaces. And, historically, a lot of the push was to diversify these events that already existed, to get more folks at these events, to make these events more equitable. And obviously we want to see that happen. But I also think there's a second conversation around that of like, how do we have our own things, right? Like, how do we get the resources to create the spaces that we want to see? Is our only hope or only move forward to continue supporting, white-led organizations or organizations led by the majority or folks who have always had the power and resources? Again, like GritFest, our ethos is for us, by us. Like our leadership matches who we want to serve. And that's a powerful move because we know more closely what marginalized folks need. And so I think there's also something to be said for divesting from events who have proven where their values are and aren't going to change. And that's an okay strategy too. I want to say that, like, yeah, we want change. And sometimes change looks like divesting from places where we're not welcome. Beckie, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think my initial thought was like, I just don't go. But I'm also, I mean, I'm not a marginalized athlete. As a straight presenting cis white woman, like I can show up in spaces that don't align with my values per se, and also know that it's very unlikely that I'm going to experience harm from being there. And I have, like, there are some races that I've taken it on like a race by race basis. And it was typically dependent on like my level of relationship with the race organizer. Like if it was a situation where I felt like I have a strong relationship with this race organizer, and by showing up and supporting them, it would actually move that relationship and our conversations forward. Maybe I had a history of having conversations about inclusivity with them. There have been times that I made the choice to go ahead and show up anyways. And then I typically send like a follow-up email. Or not as much anymore. I used to be like extremely vocal on my personal social media about different events and races. I go back and forth on the effectiveness of that. But yeah, and then there's other situations where like I'm also coming from a position where I was in the Northwest Arkansas community when there were like not a lot of women mountain biking at all. And so I really grew with that community as my career was growing, the cycling industry was growing. And so I just knew all of the organizers. And I also know the people who like, they were never going to change. They didn't want to have anything to do with the topic. They said and did things that I would never want to be associated with. And I was like, yeah, no, I'm not going to go to that event. And so, yeah, it from like the white perspective and feeling like I do have a responsibility to nurture some of those relationships and try to bring those people along on their journeys. I have made decisions to attend events in the past, even though I know they don't totally align with my values. And then there's, of course, like, I think divesting is a great strategy. For affecting change as well.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to that. I appreciate you sharing that part of like, as somebody who's less marginalized, you do have a duty to have more difficult conversations because you're not as they're not as harmful to you, right? And I wanted to add to that. I think playing the long game, oftentimes, like, there's so many experiences that I sit on for a long time. Like, I don't say anything right away, but when the iron is hot, I'm ready to strike, right? And oftentimes, like when I was talking before about, connecting with other folks and sharing those experiences, that might be you, right? Like somebody may come to you and be like, hey, what was your experience at this event? And you haven't said anything publicly, but that's your chance to be like, oh yeah, like I don't mess with that. This was my experience. Like I didn't really enjoy it. And that starts to like build too. And then there's times, like there's so many times I remember when, like in the early 2010s, like when I was kind of coming into this space where I was just fired up because I was seeing things I didn't like. And I would comment on something and be like, hey, that's kind of racist. And I'd get torn apart in the comments or whatever. And I've kind of learned how to be a little bit more strategic there, where it's like, I'm not going to say something, but as soon as this organization, like things like start to come out, I know this is my time to say like, yeah. And I mean, literally Me Too, right? Like that is where the Me Too movement came from. It's like so many people were having that experience, and then it's like this snowball. And that's sometimes what it takes to like really see a lot of change, but it's like this slow build. But know too that as an individual, it's very difficult to do it as just an individual. So I'd call on you to lean on your community as much as you can. And also, not attending is a form of divestment and protest in and of itself. Yeah, great question. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. This has been really great. I think if nobody has any more questions, we can wrap up. We know this is a little longer than typical. The broadcast will be available on our YouTube pretty soon. So if there's anything you want to go back and reference, rewatch, like feel free to do that. Share with your networks. Hopefully you found some bits of information in there that you can really start to pull back the layers and do a lot of the work that you're hoping to do in your own spheres. We have a post-event survey that we send out. Again, remember collecting that data. That will come out in an email very shortly. Please send your feedback. We really do. As you know, we really value that. We use that internally and externally to help us with some of the funding needs that we have to keep this work going. Thank you to Alicia from the Sign Language Interpretation Network. We're so grateful that we have you to lean on. Thank you, Beckie. I think this has been really cool. It's been a dream of ours for a little while to do this, so it's been really fun to pull this together. And thank you, Paula. She's not on the screen, but she's working tirelessly behind the scenes always. We couldn't do this work without her. And thank you all so much for attending the live stream.
Amazing. Thank you, Rachel. And if I said anything cringy, I really want to know. So please fill out your feedback form. And yeah, thank you everyone so much. This was amazing. We appreciate your time.